First, thanks to Robert Davis and Ed Kamenek for providing a chance for me to reprieve a piece of writing that I did 25 years ago. I'm not an archaeologist. I would never have gone back to it, I think. But for the occasion that this meeting represents. It's a book that grew out of an interest I had then and continue to have in the care and feeding of scholarly communities, mostly in their institutional circumstances, which means mostly at universities, although I've also done some work on foundations. The genesis for the book, which had the rather clunky title, International Studies and Academic Enterprise, a chapter in the enclosure of American learning. All academic titles have to have a colon and then something even longer after it, and I conform. I do it their way. The book itself is in part the story I wish to take up with you today at the launching of this NEH Summer Scholars Institute. In 1975, I was here as an assistant professor at Barnard and Columbia and was hired as a part-time consultant to the International Training and Research Program at the Ford Foundation. I had very specific responsibilities. I was supposed to go on the road, and on the road meant visiting a half dozen campuses, receiving Ford Foundation money for their various area studies programs. Mine were specifically the University of Washington, Michigan State, Syracuse, Duke, Penn, and the University of North Carolina. I don't think it irreverent to suggest that I was not part of the group that visited Harvard, Chicago, Berkeley, and Columbia. They were the first-tier institutions. I was a second-tier person in this, but I had the same set of responsibilities, just a lower profile. It was my job to find out whether these schools could get along, that is, their international studies programs could get along, if not prosper, at least survive, without any further pump priming from the Ford Foundation. Pretty straightforward situation. I didn't quite know what I was getting into. It's a little bit like showing up at a family and asking whether they can do without the breadwinner. But sure enough, again, being a cooperative sort, I got into the spirit of it. It took me a little while to figure out what the background of this situation was, but I soon found out that the Ford Foundation had spent, by this time, again, mid-70s, at least a decade, trying to move its money to another table, which was the phrase used in-house, although nothing so indelicate as that was said to the Michigan State, Syracuse, Duke, North Carolina folks. Move the money to another table. The president of the Ford Foundation, McGeorge Bundy, after a tumultuous career, first at Harvard, which wasn't so tumultuous, but in Lyndon Johnson's Washington, D.C., it was certainly tumultuous. When he came to the Ford Foundation in 1965, 1966, committed to getting the Ford Foundation deeply involved in the problems of urban America, which did not mean putting all its money into Slavic studies or East Asian studies. He asked at a conference at the Ford Foundation with all the director muckamucks who were at the various institutions, he put the question this way, in the negative interrogative form that I think was popular in academia at that point. Is it not possible that in some geographic areas, countries, and disciplines, sufficient area specialists have been trained to man the necessary positions, provide the basic research, and reproduce themselves in adequate numbers without special pump priming? That's the Ford Foundation's exit to this. 10 years after making that statement, they still hadn't been able to get out. I took that as a very serious commentary on the health of the university, that he couldn't say no to universities, but the Ford Foundation was determined to do so, and I was sent out to provide them with an explanation for why they were doing it, and then I could be pointed at, I guess, if it didn't pan out that way. So the question is formulated was this: as international studies. Area studies was the term that was being used, area programs, all sorts of different phrases, but we all, I think, know what we're talking about in this area. Had international studies become a permanent presence in the offerings of the major universities where Ford money had gone to build up their programs? No question in the Ford Foundation's mind, and I think in reality, that without Ford money in the 1950s, the growth of area studies programs simply would not have occurred. It was not until the mid-60s that federal money began to flow, and the question of whether it would have flowed in the direction that it did, I think, is very much to the credit, if you will, of the Ford Foundation for starting the spigot going. Did international studies faculty have the clout to protect the turf without the initially enabling underwriting by Ford? Would federal dollars do the job? That was the next hope for eternal optimists. Or would universities, even university endowments, be used to fund these chairs, these programs that had been previously funded by Henry Ford's profits? I offered a two-part answer, again, consistent with my company man approach. The first part was, can they survive? Yes. Of course, I was not in international studies myself, so it, kind of a disinterested position for me to take. Yes, they would be able to survive. McGeorge Bundy read my memo and really thought this ought to go immediately into a book, which would then add to the resonance of this position. So Bundy in 1967 was prepared to say, international studies are here to stay. McCaughey took another 18 years before his book was really ready, no, another 20 years, 18 years, before he published it in book form. Yes, international studies is here to stay. So Ed and Robert asked me to come back and talk to you, so I had to go back and read my book. Because I had placed a bet on certain developments. Now, if I were really doing this right, and haven't, because as Ed suggested earlier, NEH is a little tight with its money. So what I didn't think was called for was to do another book on this project. So I went back selectively, let us say. But I offer you today 3 data points that, surprise, suggest I was right. Which means that McGeorge Bundy was even righter earlier. But you, and I must say my lunch companions today, can offer contrary evidence to this, with this apologia for what has happened. But the first data point that I offer you is a local one, Columbia, in the year 2011. There are about 3,600 faculty here. In the arts and sciences, and I would include in that the School of International and Public Affairs and Barnard College, and exclude the sciences, leaves us with a humanities and social science faculty of about 750 faculty. The Columbia non-Western language and culture departments consist of 134 faculty. 134 is the numerator, 750 is the denominator. Columbia University social science departments. The history department is a huge department, although the numbers include Barnard faculty as well, but there are 125 of us. To be sure, a bunch are in modern Europe, and a substantial number, although I report declining number, in American history. But in East Asian studies, 14, in Latin American studies, 9, in Middle Eastern studies, 7, in African studies, 5, in Russian studies, 4, and in South Asia studies, 3. The relative placement of Russian I'll come back to in a moment. In political science, there are about 70 faculty. 25 of them seem to be mostly in comparative and international relations relating to parts of the world outside of Western Europe. Economics, about the same portion in international development, 25 of 70. In anthropology, more than half of the 50 or so anthropologists have regional focuses outside the Atlantic world, let us call it. Religion, even more so. They have 24 members, 10 of them dealing with Western religion or Christianity more specifically, but 8 with Asian religions and regions, and 5 Middle Eastern region, Judaism, Islam as well. In sum, about 1/3 of the Columbia Humanities and Social Science faculty have a strong, if not dominant, non-Western regional interest. This is supported by the numbers of folks in the area institutes, some 400 members. African Studies, 93 members. Latin American Institute, 109. Middle East Institute, 83. The Harriman Institute, 61. The South Asian Institute, 40. Columbia has 6 of the 125 national research centers for advanced language instruction. Now, I think that helps my case, but I then can be generous and suggest that it's not all that way. There have been some changes since 1967, and there have been changes since 1985. The biggest difference, I think, the biggest differences have been geopolitical, and they have an impact on certain regions more than others. The USSR is no longer. The Cold War is over. We live in what can be defined, I think, primarily as a post-9/11 world in which non-state or weak state states harbor or sponsor terror as a grave concern. The outer rim of what had been the Soviet Union, now a dozen independent nations who 20 years ago were all, we thought, maybe not all of you being more perceptive, but most of us thought, could be spoken for, and anyway were spoken from Moscow. This is to acknowledge the shifting focus of attention by U.S. policymakers and, I think, by an informed public. And that shift is toward the Middle East, where the United States has fought and is fighting 3 wars in the last 20 years. I guess, but I have not documented, that there are fewer American correspondents today in Moscow than in Cairo, and that my Barnard students, anyway, are more likely to be studying Arabic and Chinese more than Russian, and Islamic fundamentalism more than Marxist economics. So there's been a shift, no question about it, but it's within the international studies community, and those shifts had taken place in the earlier years as well, because they are responsive at some level to what's going on outside the university, and good for that. The second data point that I would suggest as to the permanence, to the extent that anything can be permanent, of international studies as an academic presence is its penetration of liberal arts colleges. That was not part of the deal. Ford Foundation wasn't interested in undergraduate programs at liberal arts colleges. Title VI is really only modestly and belatedly taking an interest in liberal arts colleges. But look again. Again, I use now the Barnard College example. The history department at Barnard has 14 people. 2 Latin Americanists, an Africanist, an East Asianist, and a South Asianist, along with modern European and American specialists. Barnard has 3 people, by my count, who have an active interest in Eurasia, bringing it down to the most specific way. And Kathy Nepomniachtchi and Alex Cooley, you will both meet during the course of the Institute. I went last spring up to Hobart College in Geneva, New York, to do a site visit of the history department. The department's a little smaller than Barnard's, 10 people, but it had an East Asianist, a Latin Americanist, an Africanist, and a Russianist. Now, again, to be sure that things move, the Russianist is likely to be replaced upon her retirement by either a South Asianist or a what they were calling global historian. That's unfortunate for those who wish to pursue Slavic studies or Russian history at Hobart. But in terms of the international studies community, hiring a South Asianist to replace a Russianist is not the same as hiring an expert on Minnesota or on the Cotswolds. We are still talking about that part of the world that we supposedly had neglected through most of our history. So my argument was, I think I can still get out of the room with saying that this is at least a steady state or a normal situation exists, that international studies reached a point and has reasonably effectively plateaued, drawing sources from other parts of the university, and I think more long-term sources. That is, it's coming out of the university itself. It's not somebody making a mail drop and leaving $2 million for a chair in Middle Eastern history or whatever. But then I had a second answer. And the first answer was, yes, we're okay. The second answer was, and I'm begin to sound a little bit like a lawyer, but there's something else operating here. The second answer was, even if no, not so bad. My wife argues, who's going to outlive me, she assures me, will have on my gravestone the result of being practicing Catholic, where she is a residual Presbyterian, that the epitaph will say something like, yeah, that wasn't so bad. That we'll be able to live with the circumstances, whatever they are. So this is the fatalistic Catholic rendering of it. Even if no, that is, international studies would not survive, that academic international studies was in a death spiral, that concentrating all of the nation's expertise in foreign parts in our universities, as was done in the post-war decades that the Ford Foundation was prominently in play, was not necessarily the best, and certainly not the only way to assure or enhance America's capacity for understanding the workings of parts of the world at some remove from our own borders. That is, I argued that the recent and Ford Foundation primed academic enclosure of international studies was not an unmixed blessing, and that correspondingly its unfencing would not be a total disaster. So, to take that position, an argument needed to be made to counter what I called, in my disinterested way, the self-serving efforts of well-placed academics and deans who argued otherwise, that the sky would fall and America would revert to its pre-Ford Foundation condition of abject ignorance about the outer world, and that everything that happened to us would be our just deserts at that point. Not so, said I. My argument required the assertion of the existence of an American tradition of close observation of the outer world prior to the creation of the American university, and for some time after that, operating at some remove from the university. I was not unaware of the arguments advanced about American indifference to intellectual activities. They extend at least as far back as Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s, and then around here on Morningside Heights, we always have Richard Hofstadter, who could talk eloquently about anti-intellectualism as a powerful, if not determining strain in American thought. And even today, if we listen to, I think Newt Gingrich is the most recent propagator of the notion of American exceptionalism. That's there. We do sometimes regard ourselves as a city upon a hill where everyone should be watching us. I'm right here. This is how I do it. That's there, but it is not the only approach that is offered. So I'm suggesting a revisionist interpretation. I'm engaged in a reclamation project. Give earlier Americans who took up the study of foreign parts their due. The first among these, and one could go back even earlier, but I think the first among these are folks right on the very edge of the end of the Revolution who established commercial relations with parts of the world that colonial America had not touched. East Asia is very much part of it, but so is the Pacific Northwest, where the contact with Russia as an American activity began. This is the 1790s. Contact with the Indian Ocean. American slavers extended themselves into East Africa, weren't limited to West Africa when they were going about their grisly business in the 1790s until the slave trade had been closed down. But it's the missions, the Christian missions, that are the large force, I think, for bringing attention to Americans of the rest of the world. In 1810, the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions is founded in Boston, Massachusetts. Its intention was to bring the Christian Guard to the heathen. But doing so requires a two-way exchange, and that was recognized, I think, from the outset. Americans needed to acquire language skills and needed to have extended exposure to distant parts. That is, they had to be in country and for extended periods of time. You didn't go to Burma on a 2-week trip. You went for 30 years, and you hope someone came and got you after those 30 years. But if you didn't, you hope somebody came back and got your kids, who you would send back to Williams or Amherst or later to Mount Holyoke, and then they would come back and provide another generation of this activity. So it was India, Burma, Smyrna, Hawaii. By 1860, 1,250 American missionaries are on station. And when they're on station, there are reports that come back. There are fundraising efforts. There are memoirs. Again, I can remember as a kid, and it continues to today, I think much of the American Catholic community learns about Africa when the returning missionaries come back and make a pitch for the second collection on a Sunday morning and describe their encounters. Well, there was an intellectual level, I think, some cuts above that in the 19th century, but it was a basis for American understanding of what was going on out there. Indeed, one of the risks in the missionary community was some of the missionaries going native, that they would become so identified with the folks that they were supposed to be converting that they would instead be converted the other way. A prominent leader of the American Board, Adrenon Judson, a Congregationalist, he who has undertaken to deliver a nation from the thraldom of sin has objects in view more important than the researches of antiquaries or the companionships of savants. The President of Brown worried about sending off his graduates into the missionary world, but had to be fully aware of the temptation to which missionaries are exposed when the treasures of a new language and a peculiar form of literature are presented before them. He therefore guarded himself against this with peculiar stiffness. So that attraction that a number of you have to parts of the world were very much part of that there, although you were meant to resist it under earlier institutional circumstances. Now you can let it all hang out. The long reach of the American missionary community, although admittedly less so in the Slavic world, continues on into the 20th century. How many Americans learned about China from Pearl Buck? How many Americans learned about Asia from Henry Luce? Or take it up a couple of notches, how many Harvard students learned about East Asia from John K. Fairbank? All of them coming out of missionary roots. So what about the 19th century non-missionary interest in the wider world? Curiosity, wanderlust, are folks, Americans, on the lookout for literary materials. Judson said before he went off to Burma for 30 years, when his father wanted him to become a lawyer in Boston, he said, "I shall never live in Boston." Notion of committed to some other activity. That was there even among the non-missionary community. John Ledyard grew up in the area of Stonington, Connecticut in the 1750s, walked across most of Catherine the Great's Russia in 1787 before he was turned back, and then died in Cairo awaiting a caravan to truck across the sub-Saharan Africa. You do not have to be a British academic to feel that kind of wanderlust. Or John Lloyd Stevens, who happens to be a Columbia College graduate, 1841, writing travels in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan. Or Herman Melville, going to the South Sea Islands and coming up with Teepee and Umu. Then there are independent scholars. John Pickering, a lawyer from Boston, but also a linguist in that he was proficient in, I quote, all the European and Semitic languages, plus Arabic, Turkish, Syriac, Egyptian, hieroglyphics, Malay, in several dialects. Or there was William Hickling Prescott, who became a scholar of Spanish conquest in South America. John Lothrop Motley, the rise of the Dutch Republic in the 1850s. Or Francis Parkman, somewhat later, on the French exploration, settlement, and then disgorgement in Canada. Emerson and Thoreau, interest in the Orient, albeit by translation, but more serious level. The diplomat, Eugene Schuyler, mentioned this morning, translating Turgenev in the 1860s, writing on the Turkish-Belgian War in 1876, and travels as a diplomat, an American diplomat, through the newly conquered Russian areas in Central Asia. Notes on a journey in Russian Turkestan. Again mentioned this morning, the elder George Kennan, writing on Siberia and the exile system, and then of course his son later on writing about Russian plans for the post-war era. So journalists of a very high order, I think not really to be seen as having a parallel today, where correspondents are expected to jump around from hotspot to hotspot, and just did not continue to support that kind of activity, which reached a non-academic audience in those days. John Gunther, the I Was There journalism, some of it based on considerable exposure, some of it a kind of today it's Tuesday and I'm in Arabia activity. War correspondence. William Henry Chamberlain, the Christian Science Monitor's man in Moscow between the wars, or Cyrus Sulzberger, the New York Times man. Then there were, and I used the term to describe them, although the term was used this morning by Robert, and I think it's an accurate term, called them academic pioneers. I would call them academic ambassadors. That is, that they took on a responsibility of making connections between the non-academic community, the rest of the world, if you will, and the university. American universities took on recognizable shape. That is, if we went to Johns Hopkins today, Johns Hopkins looks a little different, but not very different from its origins in the 1870s. It was Hopkins that led the way to the structure of the American university that we know. And then there were other newcomers of that period: Cornell, Stanford, the University of Chicago, some of the state universities, particularly the University of California and Michigan. But then there were also transformed colleges, older places that caught the new spirit: Harvard, Yale, Penn, and I would number Columbia very much among them. Indeed, Columbia probably took more of the juice than any of the other universities. For a while, it was quite capable of forgetting that it had an undergraduate program or an undergraduate legacy, but all of them became full-fledged universities in the sense that we know it today. And in those universities, there was a first generation of American academics with scholarly interests in the distant parts of the world. Again, the term one uses, I always liked Archibald Carey Coolidge's reference to those parts of the world, the unhealthy countries, he called them. So you have some sense of what a Bostonian would think of the rest of the world. But Coolidge and others saw themselves less as academic empire builders, although I concede and acknowledge the point of building up a library collection being very much part of what his overall plan was. But less empire builders in one sense than go-betweens, than couriers, than ambassadors. Kenneth Scott Latourette at Yale serves that function, brings China back to New Haven. Herbert Eugene Bolton does Latin America, brings it to Berkeley, California. He'd be another example of a librarian-centered person. James Henry Breasted brings the Middle East to the University of Chicago. Most relevant here is Coolidge, and it was the Slavic world that he brought to Harvard. After trying and then deciding that diplomacy was not something that he was cut out for, took a PhD not in Russian studies or anything like it at Freiburg, but then came to the Harvard History Department. Why? President Eliot's a friend of the family. That's how it was done. This was not a national search done with full transparency. Sunday dinner probably settled it, and Coolidge takes up. It also made it easy that he wasn't going to exact a salary. So again, if academic circumstances do get desperate, you can try that gambit, if you wish. If you come for free, they might do you something. Lionel Trilling, here in the 1930s, struggling to make his living on an instructorship with his wife, who was then ill and unemployed, and a father and mother who were living way over their means over in Brooklyn. So he was the sole financial source of support for them. Went to his department chairman and asked, what does one do in this case? And the chairman said, you have to start eating into your capital. No, not having any, you're in trouble. So it's Coolidge who really gets Slavic studies going, of course, on the Balkans, contemporary Balkans, and the Near East in 1897. A year-long course on Russian history the following year, made librarian at Harvard in 1910. Again, why? No longer Eliot, his family friend, but Abbott Lowell, his cousin, who's president, turns to him probably at another Sunday lunch and said, how would you like to become a librarian? Coolidge can report a year after taking on that job, for the Far East, we have perhaps the best working library out of Washington. For Russia and the other Slav countries, the best, not in the Slavic languages, in the United States. For the Ottoman Empire and the Near Eastern question, perhaps the best in the world. And then he went on to train those people who, as it was pointed out properly this morning, set up Slavic studies at Stanford, at Berkeley, and at other institutions, and then made sure at Harvard that they were well supplied with people who could carry the process on. Wiener right after him, Samuel Hazard Cross, and then William Langer taking it down into the 1950s. But even with those interests, Coolidge was at least as interested in making contact with non-academic communities of influence. Some of his proudest graduates were those who went on to diplomacy. Joseph C. Grew, who became perhaps the most distinguished of the professional foreign service operatives in the United States, ending up as ambassador to Japan in the late 1930s, was just one example. It was important to Coolidge and important to Coolidge's students that when Coolidge went to the State Department, the doorman recognized him, that he had a place in this place. And he helped found not the Slavic Review, or even helped found the American Slavic Association, but he helped found Foreign Affairs in 1919, which was a magazine addressed to the international-minded American audience. Again, not an academic. When he died, Coolidge, in 1928, Charles Homer Haskins, a medievalist, said he snapped a link between us. He meant most narrowly the Harvard History Department, somewhat more broadly Harvard, but I think, in other words, the whole university community. He snapped a link between us and the world of big affairs. And I think that's right. Interwar academization, which is the process that I've been talking about, got underway in that period, but slowly. The PhD had become a certificate of expertise. There were promotional committees. The Committee on the Promotion of Chinese Studies in the 1920s is one of the early examples. Foundations that started to give some money, Carnegie and Rockefeller. Ford is still into selling cars at that point, not providing funding. But something on the order of 30 or 40 PhDs were generated in the 1930s in areas that I can retrospectively describe as international studies. 2/3 of them in the social sciences, 1/3 in language and literature. Nearly all of them were awarded by 5 institutions: Harvard, Columbia, Chicago, Berkeley, Yale. For all of them, I think, they considered it an affordable extravagance. A little bit like back in the 1890s, there was a rush for every university that was going to be able to claim itself to be a real university. You had to have a Sanskritist. You didn't have to have 2. It'd be crazy to have 2, but you needed 1. And that person would be paraded around at the appropriate time, rather like Nobel Prize winners at some stage of the game. Outside those half-dozen universities, it was an unaffordable expense. And if you were interested in those fields and taught outside that world, you either get to get yourself into that world or come up with something else to earn your living. Then the war came and everything changed. This is the Second World War. And what we have is the ascendance of the American academic estate in general, but in international studies in particular as well. The biggest beneficiaries of the Second World War, institutional beneficiaries, were the American research universities. And within those universities, physicists, I'll concede, probably came in number 1. They lived off their situation until the biologists have permanently put them aside. But second to them were the people in international studies. They found themselves in demand, which is itself kind of levitating experience after having small classes and being sort of on the margin where the department is run by someone doing English history or American history. William Langer in 1940 asked by his 25th anniversary class to comment on what he's been doing since he graduated. My career has been the rather unruffled one of university teacher, proverbially ensconced behind the ivory tower. That had been his situation up to 1940. 12 months later, he's the recruiting officer for the OSS and bringing into all sorts of exciting, nefarious activities during the Second World War. It was his Rolodex, in effect, that put the OSS together. Look to Columbia and you take Gerald Robinson and Philip Moseley. Look to Penn and you take the Sanskritist W. Norman Brown. You look to Chicago and you take the archaeologist John A. Wilson, and you put them all in trench coats and you send them off. They don't all parachute into France, but they have exciting careers. And they're a very different crowd when they come back from the war. And in turn, they pick off some of their bright graduate students and recruit them as well. Some of those did fly in to North Africa and other places. So that there's a generation that gets equipped in a particular way. This is how Moseley described it. A prominent figure here in pressing, when Columbia sent Moseley downtown to the Ford Foundation to rattle their cage, they had to be ready for him. This was a tough guy coming down, and you just hoped you didn't give it all away, because Harvard was coming the next day in Chicago. But if Columbia got there first and they had sent Moseley, it was serious business. You checked your pockets afterward to see whether you had anything left. Moseley describing himself, obviously. People with experience in public service or in the social sciences, or both, who were able to feel their way and identify the needs and point them out. That's what they were. It's not that I grade exams very effectively or I'm a wonderful mentor to PhD students, but I can move and shake the world, and that's what I'm going to do. Well, they began pointing out these situations, not to the federal government, because we were still 20 years away from overcoming the Southern resistance to federal aid to education. Not to Washington, federal aid is 2 decades off, but to the foundations, to Carnegie and Rockefeller. They brought to them a potent argument. Our ignorance got us into trouble, read Second World War. Knowledge will keep us secure. Knowledge will let us win, not only be secure, because months after the end of the Second World War, we're into the Cold War. So in 1945, as indicated earlier, the Russian Institute comes into being here at Columbia with money from Rockefeller. In 1947, the Russian Research Center comes into being in Cambridge with money from Carnegie. Carnegie also that year set up the Center for Japanese Studies at the University of Michigan, and it probably means that from that date on, Michigan was first among equals, at least, in Asian studies. And then the money just kept coming. Columbia received $21 million from the Ford Foundation to set up all sorts of activities. There was not an area studies program that existed anyplace else that Columbia wasn't ready to replicate. In fact, the Ford Foundation would continually say, couldn't you centralize or focus on something? No, we want to do it all. And down they would come, and back they would come with the money. These were the years that were fat. In 1967, there were probably 600 PhDs awarded in what I would call international studies. 22% of them came from the top half dozen universities. So there's still concentration, but that second tier that I was sent to check out were beginning to provide a very significant portion of what was going on. So it was no longer quite so top-heavy. We're still talking about research universities. We're still talking about more privates than publics. But there's some sort of spread going on. Little was made of that. I think it's significant because that spread suggests a certain kind of strength that couldn't be there if you just depended on Harvard and Columbia and Yale to do the heavy lifting. In those days, 1960s, Russian and Slavic studies were one of the two most favored of foreign area programs, along with East Asia. Although even East Asia had its problems on that question, who lost China? And some academics had to keep their heads down for a decade until McCarthy and company passed before they could make themselves welcome again, at least in Washington. The Middle East, relatively poor and unattended cousin, but only relatively poor. Latin America depended on what Fidel was doing. If the Cuban situation could heat up, then Latin American studies got money. If it went quiet, then Latin studies got off to the side. The pattern here at Columbia is very much that. East Asian, Slavic studies, part of the core of the university. Latin America, African, the same situation. But meanwhile, more and more people are coming. Then this federal funding, precipitated, by one view, by the Russian launching of Sputnik in the fall of 1957. Within months, the National Defense Education Act is passed, and it includes the Title VI provisions that still represent a significant portion of the support that international studies get. My last data point. This NEH Summer Institute. The funder, National Endowment for the Humanities. I didn't pay a cent, and I'm getting my lunch paid for it. All right. The host, Columbia University, still in the business, actually getting better at it, one might say. The directors, with real experience in mounting these summer institutes. So this kind of infrastructure, if you will. Accommodating and supportive employers. Some of the people who employ you. We haven't all gone to a 12-month schedule. Some of us do get some time to be doing some things during the academic year other than meeting our teaching responsibilities. And someone's got to pay for that. Eurasia. Again, for an Americanist, a fairly distant part of the world. I mean, I have a secondary interest besides universities. It's maritime history. You ain't got no oceans, mostly. You know, it's a pretty dry part of the world, too. So it doesn't strike me that this would necessarily be representative of the center of international studies. But there were 60 applicants for this program, drawn from all over the country. Again, the differences I'm pointing to are ones that speak to the embeddedness of international studies in the larger academic enterprise, with changes. Let me give you 3 or 4. If you're lucky, 4 or 5 changes that are represented by what I can see here. Many more women than 25 years ago. More than half the Institute Fellows are women. More scholars from the regions they are studying. That is to say, native speakers or people who were born in regions that fall into the Eurasian group. That was predicted if all went well. And so far as it is in the process of occurring, I think it's a sign of health of the international studies program. Because I think if it were dying on the vine, there would be fewer and fewer of you in total, but I think the demographics would be different. More of you have credentials from more institutions than would have been the case in the 1940s or in the 1960s. There are more disciplines in scholarly fields included. When you did Slavic studies at one point, you had someone doing literature, you had somebody doing political science history, but art history, not early on, I don't think. Sociology, maybe, but that's no longer the case. These are not areas where only anthropologists go or only economists are interested. These are areas where American scholars are studying and bringing their disciplinary interests with them. 16 different U.S. universities are represented here, and no single university more than a couple of people. Rutgers, USC, Columbia, by my count. More disciplines in scholarly fields, to be sure. Old standbys, history, language and lit are still here, economics and political science. But art history, anthropology, information sciences, architecture, library science. A dispersion, and I think a healthy one. Then I would also say that you're teaching at more kinds of institutions. So the point I was making earlier about the penetration of liberal arts colleges is even, I think, can be made more as a result of what I can see here today. We're penetrating deeper. When I thought of liberal arts colleges, I was thinking of the sort of traditional, aside from Grinnell and Pomona, New England, Middle West liberal arts colleges. And Barnard being one of them. But we represent 8 or 9% of the academic world, and it's a declining proportion. We're all living off our endowments and the promise that we can get you into business school easier than someplace else can get you into business school. But there is an institutional mix out there that is represented here. Hawaii Pacific, the College of Staten Island, Georgia College, the University of South Florida, the University of South Carolina at Aiken, Bard, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, Barb Jones University, Drew. Okay. Finally, that you find yourself doing work in a region of the world and its many languages that 20 years ago was at such remove from American concerns as to not even rate being considered by neglected. That is, the term was not really applied. I went back and looked, and I did find one at the time in my book, a reference to your part of the world, if you will. So there's a certain embarrassment here, because I use the reference to show how reductive an argument could be made to the point of absurdity, that if you were arguing that we're neglecting it, you could push that. There's an infinite regression there, and as you'll find out who was at the end of that regression. This was I had to say, and it was with reference to an article by Dennis Sinor at Indiana University wrote in 1964, and he titled it "The Neglected Area in American International Studies." And my response to it, wise ass as ever, the specter of sufficiency could be indefinitely put off by subdividing world areas. To suggest, for example, that East Asian studies was taken care of, and to point to work being done in China as evidence, was to strengthen the case for additional support for Japanese studies. To support proposals for additional study of Japan was to invite proposals for those prepared to study Korea and Mongolia. Likewise, to approximate comprehensive disciplinary coverage in one world area was to point out the spottiness of such coverage elsewhere. To provide a South Asian program with language instruction in Hindi, Bengali, and Urdu only revealed the neglect of Tamil, Marathi, and Punjabi. Then, my final try at reductio absurdum, which I meant to be definitive here. In 1964, Uralic and Altaic were described by an Indiana University professor as, quote, the neglected area, in his view, of American university coverage of the non-Western world. Not because there were not several universities teaching Uralic and Altaic, but because at only one, his, Indiana University, was there a freestanding Uralic Altaic department. I went to Google and looked up Indiana. You'll be pleased to know, assured, fortified perhaps, Indiana University's department is still there. It's changed its title slightly, but that goes with the territory. It's the Department of Central Eurasian Studies. And while I was at this research site, that is to say Google, I made a quick search that yielded 15 other universities with language and culture programs with Eurasia in its title. To be sure, at Indiana, it has an Inter-Asia Uralic National Resource Center, and in that sense probably has been able to maintain its preeminence in that field. But all of this suggests to me that when times do look tough, and again, we spend a lot of time at lunch dealing with the California education system, and I think that does qualify as times are tough. I think the long-term view of international studies provides yet another testament to the survivability, nay, the staying power of American academic enterprise. So I wish you good luck, and thanks for having me. Thank you.